The epistle scripture given for this last Sunday in Epiphany is from Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth. It's interesting. I think most New Testament scholars think both the first and second letters of Corinth are probably combinations of 8 or 10 letters, some of which we don't have. But we read today from 2 Corinthians 4 and Paul's response to concerns about the gospel that he's preaching. So he says, "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we do not proclaim ourselves. We proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your slaves for Jesus' sake. For it is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." It was one of those moments that you remember for a long time. And it happened on the coast of New Jersey on a spring youth fellowship retreat in 1973 with a congregation where I was serving. This group had an annual spring beach retreat. They got to stay at one of the houses that belonged to one of the members of the church, and the house was about a block back from the actual beach. We drove down to the beach from Pennsylvania on a Friday evening in a rather steady rain and fog. And that rain and that fog continued through most of Saturday. The forecast was that the rain would stop late Saturday night, and on Sunday it would be warm and beautiful. It's like those weekends we often have up at Laurel Ridge, where on Sunday the sun comes out on the day you're going home. I'm sure you know what I mean. Well, before going to bed on Saturday night, late Saturday night, several of the youth in the group proposed that we should all get up and have a sunrise service on the beach the next morning. They said that would be a great way to celebrate the clearing weather, to have worship outdoors, and enjoy the beginning of a new day. I was one of several adult advisors in that group, and I said, sure, why not? Then I got some less than enthusiastic glances from some of the other adults. But anyway, we went to bed knowing that we, in only a few hours, 4 to be exact, would get up and go down to the beach for the morning service. And we did get up in the dark, and we went to the beach with the stars clearly visible, and we sat huddled on blankets facing the ocean, some of us wrapped in blankets as well, or sleeping bags. Some of the kids brought sleeping bags. I remember the ocean was very calm, with only just a few small waves landing on the shore. The sky was clear, and I recall that most of the people were pretty quiet, just sitting there watching and waiting for a new day to dawn. In a little while, the colors in the eastern horizon turned from pink to light orange, and the sun began to appear over the distant edge of the water, with long reflections across the water coming from the sun as if to point directly toward this huddled group on the beach. What I remember so vividly is that the sun seemed to come up so quickly. Like one minute it was dark, and the next minute you could feel the light and the warmth. And the sky became bright blue, and we sat there almost in silent amazement at what we were seeing. And then, as if he couldn't contain himself any longer, one of the boys in the group jumped up and raised his arms toward the sun and said, "Let light shine, let light shine." Everyone paused for a moment, and then they laughed and they smiled. And we all stood up and joined him at the edge of the water, and everyone in that group said, "Let light shine, let light shine." We all shared in the joy and the proclamation of that good news. We got in a circle on the beach. We had a prayer of thanksgiving for the beauty and the gift of the new day. We sang a song, and we walked back to the beach house laughing and playing and sharing our responses to the sight of that big light coming up just for us on that spring morning on the shore of New Jersey. You know, the gift of that light was beautiful, and it changed that whole weekend retreat into something different, something more than we could have expected, something that made us a stronger group somehow, something inspiring and transforming. Today is the last Sunday after Epiphany, the last Sunday in this season of light, of this season of the revealing of Christ as light of the world. And today we've heard from Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, his own strong proclamation of the light and the lordship of Christ. And it's almost as if Paul himself is saying to this young church in Corinth, "Let light shine, let light shine." Of course, a closer reading of the third chapter that precedes this one shows us that Paul was having a bit of a struggle with some of the Christians in Corinth who were moving away from the gospel that Paul preached. As he states here in the passage we just read, his attention is on the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And he quotes the biblical story of creation from Genesis 1:3, where it is God who says, "Let light shine." Let light shine out of darkness. This is for Paul the same God who brings light to our hearts, to our lives, to our world by giving us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. Carl Holliday writes in his commentary on 2 Corinthians that Paul's use of the creation story, with its emphasis on God's power to give light to the world in the beginning, is now carried on in the Christ event itself, where the light of Christ brings in a new creation. The light of Christ changes the world, and it changes the people who embrace this light, the people who can even let this light shine through them to the world. You could say that for Paul and his point of view, and I would suggest ours, that in Jesus Christ, God has given light to the world once again. So let light shine. Let light shine. Let Christ's light shine. Let our light shine. Because a new age is here now. A new order is here in Christ. New life is here. The one who can make all things new has come among us in the flesh, and we have seen him, the light of the world. On a mission trip to New York, I remember talking to Frank. Frank had been living on the street in New York City. He had been struggling with alcohol abuse and depression for many years, he said. He ended up in the Moravian shelter for the homeless, and eventually he got off the street and he stayed sober. He said that at the shelter he experienced a life that had never been real for him before. A life centered in community, in caring, and in non-judgmental acceptance. He told me there was just something about these people that worked there, these Moravians, and I remember he said, whatever that is. He said they had a presence about them and a spirit. It was almost like they lit up, he said, every time they opened that front door and welcomed us into the shelter and hospitality and love of this community. He said, Rick, I learned about Jesus here. I met him here. I saw him in this place. Let light shine. Evidently, some of Paul's critics said that his gospel was veiled. A reference to Moses, of course, and the veil that he wore before God because he couldn't look at God. But Paul insists that the glory of Christ is not something hidden to the world or from us. It is something bright and radiant and active in the world. If people are blinded to the light, it's the gods of this world that do the blinding, that keep them from really seeing the light of the gospel. It's interesting that the critics that Paul refers to were called super apostles by Paul. And they wanted and preached a gospel of Christ that had only the glory, but not the suffering. Only the glory, but no call to servanthood. Only the glory of a God who watches earth and the world from a position somewhere adjacent. He sees all the challenges and struggles, but there's no call to bring light to those facing or dealing with those challenges and struggles. This gospel was a feel-good gospel that didn't require change and certainly didn't require sacrifice. So here in Corinthians, Paul counters that proclaiming his gospel is proclaiming the gospel of the visible light of Christ in the world. It's not about rhetoric, Paul says. It's not about underhanded methods or big-time marketing schemes. It's not about feel-good messages. Paul challenges the church in Corinth and the church in Winston-Salem to decide what vision of reality actually represents the knowledge and glory of God. He challenges us to think about the gods of this world that can blind us, that keep the real light of Christ from shining, that keep our light from shining, that indeed do veil the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. I don't know how you see this challenge or how you feel blinded in this world, but the struggles we have with the gods of this world are very real, and they are many. Struggles with the gods of success and power and control. Struggle with the gods of accumulating more and more wealth. Struggles with the gods of privilege and tradition and lifestyle. Struggle with those who are in and those who are out. With the growing distance between the haves and the have-nots. Struggles with the gods of comfort and pleasure that can smother and distract us from the good news. The gods of this world are difficult to deal with, and I would be less than honest if I didn't say that I get blinded by them all the time. And I know that you do too. The feel-good gospel can make us want the glory and yet be satisfied with the status of the world. Writer and New Testament scholar Ronald Allen says that Paul's gospel won't let us do that. He says it calls for a holy discomfort with the status of the world, It calls for the followers of Christ to not just accept the world as it is, to not accept injustice and exploitation and brokenness and scarcity and violence and death, but rather to believe that the light of Christ reveals to us God's desire to increase community and wholeness and justice and abundance and peace and love and life. These are the realities of the new world that Christ brings to us. And these are the realities of letting light shine in the world. So how do we let light shine? I think Paul gives us some pretty good gospel advice here. And the core message is that Jesus Christ is Lord of our lives. And we let light shine when we know and serve Christ in the world. In that service, we don't center on ourselves. The gospel is not about us. We proclaim Christ and ourselves as the servants of others for Jesus' sake. We move out of the spotlight. As Barbara Brown Taylor puts it, we clearly understand who serves whom. God is not some cosmic butler who caters to our every need. Rather, we are those who are being transformed by God's presence as we give witness in the world to what we see in the face of Jesus. Jesus is the light who has come into the world. This is the light we have seen and to which we testify. We don't preach our programs or our projects or our preferences. We don't preach where we've been or what we think about what we've accomplished. We preach a gospel and a way of faith and life that day by day responds to the opportunities we have to minister by word and deed to our neighbors. To let light shine, we seek to live as servants to those who need the saving love that has been revealed to us in the very face of the Lord of life. You know, I have long since lost touch with the boy who stood at daylight on that beach in New Jersey and inspired us all to let light shine. I've thought about that morning many times through the years and remembered the fellowship and the joy and the sheer determination of that group of young believers staring into the bright light that signaled to us a new day. In our own way, that morning we were Epiphany people. And as followers of Christ in this place, we are Epiphany people every morning as well. For we know and we believe it is the God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So, brothers and sisters, receive that light, claim that light, and live that light for Jesus' sake. Let light shine. Amen.